Netaskika no netaski mahapanakoti paksimotak mina iwedino kuti mina stawino kisike gawino kitaskino hey 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 yo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session on land, environment, and language. Apologies for our bit of a late start. We've had some technical things that have been worked through, and this is so wonderful to be here with you. I'm Warren Carrio, and from the University of Manitoba Center for Creative Writing and Oral Culture. And I just introduced myself in the last session, so I'm not going to do it again this time. But it's my honor to open this session with two amazing, multi-talented artists, Indigenous artists and researchers, teachers, and knowledge keepers, really, of their communities. Both have deep knowledge of the relationships among Indigenous and Irish cultures as well, which is the focus of our session today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the organizations that have made this gathering possible: the Ireland Canada University Foundation, the Centre for Creative Writing and Oral Culture at the University of Manitoba, the Centre for Canadian Studies in University College Dublin, and the Craig Dobbin Visiting Professor, University College Dublin. And again, just a reminder to anyone who would like to support our work, everything is free here, but we do have expenses that we need to cover. And so if you're able to support us, that would be fantastic. And there will be links posted throughout the day to how to do that. So this session, as I said, examines the interweavings between Irish and Indigenous cultures. And our presenters have a lot of knowledge on this topic to share with us. Sherry Farrell Racette, who is Métis Algonquin Irish, is an interdisciplinary scholar with an active arts and curatorial practice. Very active, I would say. And she was born in Manitoba, is a member of the Temiskaming First Nation in Quebec, and she is celebrated as a painter, illustrator, historian of Métis material cultures, beadwork expert, and so much more. Sherry teaches in the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Regina. Joining her is Cheryl Larondelle, who's Cree half-breed, German and Polish, and who is an interdisciplinary, community-engaged artist, a singer-songwriter, and a critical thinker whose family roots are from Papaschase Cree Nation and from Kikino Métis settlement. Cheryl is enormously accomplished as an artist, a songwriter, and performer, and she recently received the Governor General's Award for Arts in Canada, which is kind of a big deal. She, as a member of our organizing committee, Cheryl has been invaluable, given her dual study, because she knows so much about Indigenous cultures, but she's also doing a PhD at University College Dublin in Ireland. So this wonderful knowledge base that she brings to our organizing and will bring to this session is going to be so amazing. So we'll start with Sherry's paper, which is called Harps, Shamrocks, and the Red Saloon, the Métis-Fenian Alliance of 1869 to 1870. And then after that, we'll have Cheryl's presentation, Sounding Sovereignties. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. And I will turn things over now to Sherry. And we'll try to get we have a PowerPoint, I think, as well here. So Sherry, thanks so much for being here, and take it away.
Okay, do I have images? Maybe not. Yes, I do. Okay, go back one. There should be one before that. Right? Yes, no? Or do I just have a single image? Okay, well, I'm going to start. What I had wanted to show you was a large map of Rupert's Land. So this is a small, complicated story that takes place in a larger, complicated story. And I know that a lot of you won't know this history. So the context is 1670, an English mercantile company is granted exclusive rights to trade on all lands draining into Hudson Bay, which is a huge body of water. Similar to the British East India Company, the Hudson's Bay Company evolved into a quasi-corporate colonial arm. And this story takes place in the context of the dramatic events that unfolded in 1869 when the company transferred that huge tract of land to the new country of Canada, which was formed in 1867. And in the middle of that broad territory, a small settlement in the middle, the Red River Settlement, that had an estimated population of about 12,000 people, and the majority were Métis. Not quite 50-50 Anglo-Métis and French Métis, but 80%, at least 80%. They were also a very large, they had a large hunting economy, and they were also a young community, very young community. A lot of the people living there were under the ages of 18. So that feisty, rather well-educated community formed a national committee to stop the land surveyors and turn back a lieutenant governor from Ottawa. Both actions that took place, Canada jumped the gun. They took place before the actual transfer became law. So three of the men who were involved, Louis Riel, who, has a legendary history in Métis history and Canadian history, but also James Ross and Thomas Bunn were both, had legal training. And so they followed international law very carefully and established a provisional government. So this is, they replaced the Council of Assiniboia, which was the Hudson's Bay Company territorial government. And this complex series of events results in the first Métis resistance and the creation of the province of Manitoba in 1870. So the names that I will be mentioning, and I'll just briefly tell you who they are. Louis Riel, who was the Secretary of the National Committee, was elected to become president of the provisional government. Ambrose Lepine, who was the head of the military council. And Thomas Scott, a laborer from Ontario, who had just been fired from working on a big colonial road project. But he was an Orangeman. And he became much more significant in his death than in his life. I had hoped to be able to show you this, what is an iconic image, and perhaps there'll be some way that I can share it so that those of you who are in attendance can take a look at what I mean. There's this iconic photograph of the provisional government. It's actually the executive committee. At the center is the newly elected Louis Riel, surrounded by his council, and really in very, very intimate and close proximity, with their arms on his knee and the hand on his shoulder, are two Irishmen. So the provisional government formed a legislative assembly to govern and to negotiate with Canada. And one of the first actions that they took was to occupy the Hudson's Bay Company post of Upper Fort Garry. They lowered the Hudson's Bay Company flag and raised a flag of their own. And there are no surviving flags. We only have multiple descriptions of flags with familiar symbols. No matter how varied the descriptions, the common elements are a buffalo, the French fleur-de-lis, and two Irish symbols, the harp and the shamrock. Now, there were very few Irish involved in the fur trade, and only a handful of people in the Red River settlement were of Irish descent. So the symbols came from within the provisional government itself. So the two men sitting close to Louis Riel were recent arrivals to the Red River settlement. Hugh O'Lone, whose nickname was Bob, arrived in 1866, and William Bernard O'Donoghue had arrived the year before in 1868. Virtually nothing is known of O'Donoghue, other than he was born in County Sligo in Ireland in 1843 and came to the United States as a child. He met Archbishop Grandin, who was on his way to the Red River settlement in Port Huron, Michigan in 1868, and he was persuaded to join the Catholic mission at Red River. He settled in at St. Boniface College as a mathematics teacher and began training for the priesthood. O'Lone was a very different character. He was born in 1836 in Hell's Kitchen, New York, And like many Irish New Yorkers, he enlisted in the Union Army in 1862. He was wounded and discharged in 1865 at the rank of first lieutenant. He came west after heavily investing in whiskey. So that was his plan for the future, to become a whiskey trader in the West. And he was nudged across the American border, the occupational hazards of being a whiskey trader, and took his bountiful supply of whiskey to Portage la Prairie, where he set up shop. But that was not very profitable because the Métis living in that area were teetotaling Anglicans, and they weren't interested. So he took his trade to the Red River settlement and set up the Red Saloon, a modest establishment just down the road from Upper Fort Garry. He was a popular local character who played a role in Winnipeg's emergence as a town. It has been suggested that this famous photograph was actually taken in the Red Saloon, where the boys, because most of them were in their 20s, might have taken a drink after a hard day of anti-colonial action. Both O'Lone and O'Donoghue were elected to the First Council of 24 and later the Provisional Government. O'Lone representing Fort Garry, O'Donoghue St. Boniface. O'Donoghue in particular was a trusted member of the inner circle. He was appointed treasurer. He was in the thick of the action. He helped seize Upper Fort Garry. He rode with Ambrose Lepine to stop and capture a pro-Canada party who marched against the Métis Provisional Government. As a member of the Legislative Assembly, O'Donoghue advocated for voting privileges for all property owners, including women, advocating in particular on behalf of the Grey Nuns. In some respects, the conflict at Red River was a war of flags. Flags were flown to indicate loyalties. When the Métis seized Upper Fort Garry, they lowered the Hudson's Bay Company flag and raised a flag of their own. Opposition parties flew the Union Jack. Fenian flags were observed. At one point in negotiations, Riel raised the Union Jack up the flagpole at Upper Fort Garry in a celebratory and conciliatory gesture to indicate progress in negotiations with Canada. O'Donoghue promptly removed the flag and restored the Provisional Government flag. Then Riel ordered that flag lowered again, and the Union Jack. So this went up and down a couple of times until Riel finally installed André No to guard the bottom of the flagpole so that O'Donoghue couldn't take it down again, take the Union Jack down again. So at that point, O'Donoghue stole a flagpole from a nearby store, dragged it into the fort, and hoisted the Provisional Government flag. So let's just quickly flip through these and catch me up. So that is the size of Rupert's Land. Next. Oh, yep. Where am I? Nope, lost them again. Darn. If we could get the picture of the gentleman and a couple of shots of the flag, that would be awesome. But I'll carry on. The execution of Thomas Scott, which is a story too complicated to go into here, focused the opposition and became a rallying cry in Canada that colored and continues to color the accomplishments of the Provisional Government. Concern with maintaining peace and unity between French and Anglo-Métis tempered subsequent actions, while O'Donoghue's anti-British fervor and his growing frustration with Riel grew. And that close alliance began to fracture. Because what came forward was that O'Donoghue dreamt of a Fenian republic in the West that the Métis would help establish. But the Métis were offended by his assumptions and his disregard for their concerns, which is to maintain peace in the settlement and unity between the French and British, Anglo and French Métis. O'Lone, ever the pragmatist, had hoped that the Métis would guide the territory into a union with the United States, and when that looked like it was not going to happen, expressed his disappointment by getting roaring drunk, raising the stars and stripes outside the Red Saloon, shooting fireworks and guns off on July 4th. This was in anticipation of the passing of the Manitoba Act. The Manitoba Act was passed in July, and Manitoba entered Canada as a tiny province, but with full provincial authority and powers, which was very different from what the original plan was. But under the subsequent Canadian military occupation, chaos ensued. So the peaceful transfer of power, which Riel and the provisional government anticipated, did not happen. Fueled by anti-Catholic, anti-French, anti-Métis hatred, a number of Ontario volunteers who were Orangemen had, joined in substantial numbers with the Ontario militia. Riel and Lepine fled across the border with a price on their heads. Unchecked violence, thank you. Okay, so here they are. Here's the Irishmen. So in the center is Louis Riel, and in the lower left, sitting on the floor with his knee very casually on Riel's knee, is Bob O'Lone, and then sitting immediately at Riel's, well, this is my right, his left, is William O'Donoghue, the treasurer. Unchecked violence was unleashed against the French Métis in particular, although even the American consulate who came to visit during this difficult period was assaulted. And this violence also included women and girls. O'Donoghue had fled across the border with Riel and Lepine, and O'Lone left after Elziar Goulet, Lepine's second in command, was murdered by members of the Ontario Rifles. The confrontation had actually started in the Red Saloon and spilled into the street. The improbable Irish-Métis alliance had ended in disillusionment, but it was briefly healed following Goulet's death. When reports of the violence reached them, as they were living just across the border near Pembina, Riel, Lepine, and O'Donoghue met and decided they needed to go back. Returning to Manitoba, they held a secret meeting with French Métis leaders at the home of Father Richaud, a Catholic priest, where they drafted a memorial and petition to the American government outlining the perfidious treachery of the Canadian government. The meeting was interrupted. There were spies all over the place, and they knew that Riel and the Métis were gathered at Father Richaud's, and apparently Riel left in such a hurry that he left his sash behind. And the sash had a long, complicated history and was eventually returned to the family. Now, the story doesn't end well for the Irishmen. It doesn't end particularly well for the Métis either. But Bob O'Lone died a few months after the secret meeting, a casualty in the sprawling violence where with suspicious speed, men who played a role in Thomas Scott's execution or in the provisional government were assaulted and their property destroyed. Several were killed or left for dead. In early January 1871, O'Lone was assaulted at a half-breed dance on the Pembina River, where he was hit with the butt of a pistol, cracking his skull, and died from his injuries. Like all the assaults that took place over that period of 2 and 3 years, there was minimal investigation and no one was ever charged. O'Donoghue's part in the tale loops back to the 1860 Fenian Brotherhood raids on Canada. O'Donoghue had been the secret meeting's chosen emissary and had been directed to deliver the Métis memorial and petition to the Minnesota governor. Riel had refused to support O'Donoghue's plan to annex Manitoba and the Northwest to the United States, so O'Donoghue, on his own, modified the memorial and traveled to Washington to advocate for American annexation. When that failed, he turned to the Fenian Brotherhood in New York, met with their inner circle, including John O'Neill and other leaders. The Brotherhood listened sympathetically, offered prayers rather than concrete support. But this led to a split in their numbers as well. John O'Neill chose to defy their position and joined O'Donoghue, rallying a small group of Fenians to their cause. And that cause was now the Republic of Rupert's Land, with William O'Donoghue as its first president. Port Huron, Michigan, which is where O'Donoghue had first met Grandin, was a Fenian center, and it was from there that Springfield rifles were secured for the Manitoba action. O'Donoghue anticipated that despite their tensions, that he might count on Métis living on the American side to rise and welcome a Fenian raid. So riders were sent out from Pembina, which was a small Hudson's Bay Company post 2 miles south of the Canadian border, to rally support. But they were unaware that spies and double agents had infiltrated Fenian ranks, so word of the impending raid had already reached the Red River settlement. When the rumors reached Riel, he addressed a gathering outside the St. Norbert Church, saying, "Our friend O'Donoghue has failed, and it behooves us to provide protective services to the new governor of Manitoba." And quite a large number actually turned up, a squadron of Métis horsemen. This was a magnanimous gesture on the part of Riel in the midst of, this chaos and violence around them. And the governor's reciprocal act of shaking hands with Riel and the other leaders was considered scandalous, and that handshake became the front page news in local, regional, and national papers. In the meantime, John O'Neill, who was a seasoned Fenian campaigner who led a successful northern raid in 1866, captured the Hudson's Bay Company post at Pembina with 40 men, including O'Donoghue. They seized supplies, and October 5th, 1871, headed for the border. Less than 4 hours later, they were apprehended and arrested by a nearby American Army unit. O'Donoghue and a few others escaped, only to be captured by a Métis party from Red River. 3 weeks after the kerfuffle, 3 Métis men were arrested at the border under suspicion of being part of the invading party: André Jérôme, Isidore Villeneuve, and Louis Oiseau-Latendre. They were married men with large families, and it was Jérôme's eldest sons, who were 12 and 15 at the time, who had actually driven the loaded Red River cart filled with Fenian guns. Jérôme took pride in his involvement, and he told a reporter in 1906 that he had taken an active part against the British government in the Riel Rebellion and O'Donoghue's Fenian raid, and shared stories of the abuse, some historians have called it torture, that he endured to force him to disclose the secret operations of his leaders. But as he recalled to the reporter, "My word was my bond, and I took my hardships and cruelties until finally liberated." The 3 men were imprisoned at the Big Stone Fort, treated badly, and held long after the Fenians were released on the American side. There's correspondence from Jérôme's father advocating for his release in 1872, so he was in prison for at least a year. In his application for amnesty, O'Donoghue wrote, "The so-called Fenian raid into Manitoba was a misnomer. Fenianism had nothing whatever to do with it. It was simply a continuation of the insurrection inaugurated in 1969 with the same intention and by the same parties, neatly throwing Riel under the bus." In the 1875 legislation granting amnesty to members of the provisional government, which was a gesture of reconciliation from Canada, 3 men were excluded by name: Louis Riel, Ambrose Lépine, and O'Donoghue. Riel and Lépine banished for 5 years, O'Donoghue for life, although even though it was only passed in 1875, O'Donoghue was granted clemency in 1877, but he died of tuberculosis the following year. Although observers of the day believed that the outcome of the raid would all depend on how it stood with the Métis role in diffusing O'Donoghue's raid in subsequent histories was diminished. Archbishop Taché responded to one author in an open letter, infuriating at having been misrepresented and misquoted himself. He writes, "Why, sir, not a single syllable in your narrative of Gingras, Marion, Lévesque, Roy, Gonfond, de Paris, etc. Your whole narrative seems entirely directed against the French Métis, their friends and their leaders. You abuse them, you misrepresent them, their views, their words, and when they form a quarter of the volunteers and secure all the saddled horses of the place to form a vanguard, you ignore them. In later interviews as elderly men, more than a few of those Métis men in that force reflected that they had actually only joined out of curiosity, wanting to see for themselves what their old friend O'Donoghue was up to. So that is the reason why the commemorative stamp, which is a version of this photograph, issued to recognize Manitoba's sesquicentennial, has two Irishmen in the image, and why shamrocks and harps were on the Métis flags of 1869-70. Écossais.
Thank you so much for that, Sherry. Fascinating. What a great, amazing history to have uncovered here for us. I know I'm mindful of time here, and so I want to move just straight to Cheryl's presentation, aiming to conclude right around 30 minutes past the hour. So hopefully that will be okay for you, Cheryl. And we'll turn it over to you. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Waneskak pewa panoma sa sepisi sagnigamuak baby yuanagwan kitoskino ayo hey yo. My idea of a perfect world would be one where all meaning would be derived through song, and where through song we would be instructed how to act and interact with one another, with all living beings, and importantly, with the land. The wake-up song I just started with was, for Cree camps, the original alarm clock, where a camp crier would have arisen during that blue light of dawn, that thin strip, where stony First Nation knowledge keeper Sykes Powderface refers to as the time of day when blessings are most abundant. The crier, moving from lodge to lodge, would gently awaken the entire camp with these words, beckoning all within hearing range. Wanska, bewa banoma. Wake up, the dawn is arriving. Ase piesi saknigamuak. Already the birds are singing. Come and see that our land is looking good. So much of this wake-up song is deeply encoded, and the English translations are insufficient, paling in any ability to relay the real meaning and intent. But in an attempt to contextualize a bit more, the song is an agreement with nature to be aware, to listen, to see, and to feel the powerful, embodied, and embedded connection we have with nature. And it is not a song of a single experience. It beckons participation, relatedness. And if you think of it, the narrative extends and is referenced throughout the day, only to be told again and again and again, reminding us of the importance of our senses, of renewal, of gratitude, and of prayer. I had my first awakening of many in my early adulthood. At the time, I was rejecting Christianity that was imposed upon me, and I was searching out pagan or earth-centered ways of being, ways that I sensed were part of my ancestors' connection to the land. At that time, in the late 70s and early 80s, there was little from an Indigenous point of view that had been published or was widely available, except for books such as Edward Hennequ's Voices of the Plains Cree, Maria Campbell's Half-Breed, and Howard Adams' Prison of Grass. However, for me, I happened upon two books that were of immense consequence. The White Goddess by Robert Graves, and Dr. Ann Anderson's Nihiowiwin Dictionary with accompanying cassette tapes. It's thanks to Ann's dedication to fostering Cree language learning in the 70s that I started to wake up every morning with Cree sound shapes rolling around in my mouth and an ever-deepening awareness of the mystery I knew I was connected to. And through Robert Graves, though he was a British mythographer, his historical grammar of poetic myth and the connection he made between the Druidic codification of Gwelga and Welsh languages and the sound shapes as it related to the annual growth cycles of the indigenous trees on both of your lands had me truly spellbound. Gawi mau ke mamo ipi moti non na skomanan kaya siwi pakana tamatanan esigita tatugisigaw ho gawi mau pe matsu enki mamo e uitapsumtano hey oh. Though all human spoken language is earth-based by its very genesis, I sense that many, and most noticeably the language we're commonly communicating in today, are from outside of an indigenous, earth-centered, and earth-caring cosmology, and they no longer speak to the land in the way the language demonstrably comes from the land, is gauged by the land, and engages with the land. Manchan, who spoke just previously, he eloquently affirms this connection between Gwelga and your island in 32 words for field at every turn of the page. At every turn of the page, spirits are there reminding us. The late John Moriarty contended that, and I'm quoting here from his book Dreamtime, almost from the beginning, the wall that Hadrian had built across the north of England became an inner wall, a defensive wall. It has served its sundering purpose only too well, and we, its prisoners, we have gone on building it, deepening it, widening it, and filling up the cracks in it. And the tools we have been using all along have been what Black poet Audre Lorde refers to when she wrote, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." I'm using these quotes, of course, speaking about this language that we continually use as our common translator. Luckily, though, and for the sake of my argument, American linguist Dan Everett insists that the evidence of tools that were made by our long ago ancestors Homo erectus is a direct link to languages in humans. And as has been introduced on the opening of this event on the first day by Liam and by Porafé, we've always been boat builders and able to voyage great distances. Papa's Chase, the chief of my reserve, was a seer, and he, among many others gifted with this ability, prophesied that there would be a wooden boat, people coming from the other side of the great waters. This is how the word for European was derived. Mystikosoino, literally, wooden boat being. I even have it tattooed on my arm here because I'm part of that. So gatherings such as this one remind me that we've always had visions of each other and common tools in our languages to take down Hadrian's wall, to rebuild our houses, and to speak across the great divide of the Atlantic. The words to the song I sang were roughly, "O great mother, all of us walk on you every day, and we are grateful. So in this time while the weather is changing, we will remember that it is your life, how we are all tied together as one." I was commissioned by Mi'kma'ki artist Ursula Johnson to compose that song and to teach it to her in a performance we did several years ago. And it's proof that even across our many nations here on this land now known as Canada, that we continually are working towards common understandings, friendship, and we're in the process of treaty making. The songs I love best are the ones inspired from a vision or a dream, by engagement with nature, and as a promise or a pledge. A large part of my practice in writing songs is through direct engagement with nature, a process that the late American composer Pauline Oliveros called deep listening. It's a process philosopher David Abram articulates in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, as being rooted in the sensual dimension of experience, born of the body's native capacity to resonate with other bodies and with the landscape as a whole. We know we need to remember old agreements and repair our relationships with all of nature, and we need to stretch and be multilingual, becoming more familiar with the language sounds of many lands. On this land, we had trade languages that allowed people to travel great distances and still be able to communicate. And oh, so many and still are multilingual. And they are our greatest gifts that we have. Anishinaabe and Métis elder and poet Duke Redbird wrote in his master's thesis, Algonquin languages have been linked directly to the Om, the ancient tongue of the Druids. And he goes on to say the debate is whether the Druids got the language from the Algonquins or the Algonquins received it from them. Perhaps now it is a new types of trades, not based on imperialism, colonization, and neoliberalism, that we can honor, cherish, and grow our wealths, our languages, and our connection to Mother Earth. But first step would be, let's become familiar with the sound shapes of our languages in the spirit of friendship and right relationships. The words to the song I sang were composed in two languages, Anishinaabemowin, or Algonquin, and Nihioiwin, or Cree, as a personal promise I made to the plant medicines and birds in the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, also known as the place now called Toronto. They roughly translate to, birds, I hear you. I respect and care for you. Plants, I will listen to you. I will keep things clean for you. I promise this. Big thank you to the medicines. I promise this, Mother Earth. The reason I chose Anishinaabemowin instead of Haudenosaunee is because the creation of the song was inspired from writing by Potawatomi botanist Robin Wall-Kimmerer in her amazing book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she reminds us that the plants have their own stories and their own songs. It seemed important for me to move outside of the comfort I have for singing in my language and incorporating the sound shapes that come from the language at that place. The song then acts as a treaty I am making with what my mentor, Maliseet artist Shirley Bear, reminded me was for the healing of Mother Earth and all her beings. But if I'm being too obtuse here, let me share why a treaty song is a big deal to Northern Plains people. Elder Jimmy Mio of Soda First Nation says that you cannot begin to understand the treaties unless you understand our cultural and spiritual traditions and our Indian laws. The laws he is putting forth is that of the natural laws, what Tewa scientist Gregory Kahedi articulates as the laws of interdependence. This interdependence is experienced from even the most subtle stimuli, such as the beating of a butterfly's wings that can, under the right conditions, trigger large-scale and worldwide effects. Inherent in natural law, from a Great Northern Plains Indigenous point of view, are the teachings of the life force, or Mi'opamatsuwin. Cree language specialist Leona Makosa shares this knowledge passed down to her as the four lessons of the land: grass, trees, animals, and rocks. Within this teaching, grass is symbolized as kindness, as it grows to cover and hold together the earth. Trees symbolize honesty and balance, as they fulfill their purpose by growing towards the sun. Animals symbolize compassion, because they share their lives for our sustenance. And rocks are symbols of strength, determination, and resilience. So to close, I propose as we move forward, we continue to sing to each other the sounds of our languages and worldviews in the same way the Maoris do when guests from other places arrive at their wharanui, their ancestral ceremonial houses. And then let's expand our ability to hear each other's language sounds while we simultaneously reduce the need to have English be the common translator. And let's dream new dreams and sing new songs. To finish, I'll sing an old song, and I've asked my brother Joseph Natauhau to come and join me on this song. It's inspired from prophecy and a vision, and as such, it becomes an important asset in the covenant it references, that of the signing of the treaties between Treaty 6 people, where I am from, and that of the British Crown. By singing it, one is, in a sense, conjuring the symbols described and reinforcing the sacredness of the agreement made, though tragically not upheld. The words translate to Queen, she who has prophesied that at this place a flag continually ought to blow in the wind here. And I'm happy we're singing this song after Sherry's wonderful story. So Native people, we don't have flags per se, but what the Cree words are actually articulating is that something is being hoisted and being offered, hung, so that the wind can carry the prayers imbued with it to that of the spirit world. This, as a vision, would have intimated to the person who had the prophecy and had the dream that the flag seen hanging would have been fortuitous, and so that the treaties that were negotiated and signed should have been powerful promises between representatives of Gicho Ogamosqueo, the Queen, and all of our original chiefs to care for us all, and for 7 generations still to come, as what many important decisions made by Indigenous people on the land now known as Canada should always entail. So with that, we'll finish with a short version of this treaty song. Yeah.
Wow. Wow, thank you so much. And thanks, Cheryl, for beginning our session with song as well. Wonderful. Now, I see by the clock we've only got 2 or 3 more minutes, I'm sorry to say, before we have to move on to our next session. And I really wish we had a lot more time to visit and talk about the interconnections of what you guys are talking about. I'm not sure, Sherry, maybe do you have any last observations? I think to me, one of the interesting things that connected your papers is the sensory and that image of the flag that you talked about, Sherry, as a way of connection. And then in Cheryl's presentation, of course, the song as connection, and then of course the image of the flag there too. So Sherry, do you have any last thoughts? I'm sorry to put you on the spot here at the end.
No, when I was thinking about, because we have flag songs and then the reference to the flag, I just have this idea somehow that we had something flag-like that played as kind of similar role, and that we kind of grandmothered those meanings onto what appeared to be European flags, but they were obviously so much more. Because, every Métis family had a flag. Sometimes it was just a random piece of cloth. People used to wave garments. At one point in the story I didn't put in, but a woman got so frustrated with the flags going up and down that she took her shawl on a pole and stuck it in her front yard. But just that idea of suspending something as a way of communicating, and what it means in terms of alliance. So I think that there's definitely something there. For sure,
there's
something linguistically.
And also, for those in the Irish community listening in, they'll know that all of the sacred trees are always filled with pieces of cloth, as sort of prayer offerings. So it's interesting conjecture that we may have gotten that actually from the Irish, because we call that Weep Wanasana now, and that's something that is a prayer offering that goes to the spirit world. So it's very possible that that's something we got from the Irish. It'd be interesting to do some research on that, Sherry?
Yeah. There were such deep connections, and a lot of those deep connections and exchanges happened in the context of loving relationships and families. Because there was a lot of intermarriage. Like, you've got, 2 million Métis in Canada. So obviously we got along really well at some point. I know I'm the embodiment of the kind of Quebec mixtures where there's a lot of Irish came into Quebec. They built the Rideau Canal, died by the hundreds. Part of my family came into the Maritimes as part of a very early logging thing. And then, shared this not very happy space in the colonial structure and social hierarchies, but managed to have a lot of fun in that marginalized space. And that's where those teachings were shared.
And I just want to say to anyone listening that in Ireland, if you ever want to have amazing sessions of really good historical stories, Sherry, I wish we had more time. I'd ask you to tell the stories about when the Irish first came and started mixing with the native people here. You've told me so many. So I hope in the future there's opportunities that, you can visit Ireland and tell some of those many stories that you have.
Absolutely, and I think this is, as the other sessions have been, this is the beginning of a conversation that can continue in other forms. And I know you two have had these conversations for a long time already, and I know we've had our own as well. But I think to broaden that, to connect more with our Irish colleagues and some new friends that we've made, some other people we know from a while back already, I think that's just going to be so productive. And I really see in your work that sense of allegiances that maybe only last for a short amount of time, but that's to resonate for a long time. I think I've got a text saying we could take another couple minutes if you guys have anything else to respond to here.
Well, also, as someone who does material culture research, I do a lot of traveling into museum collections, and I just want to do a shout out to the National Museum of Ireland, where I've had the privilege of visiting their collection a couple of times, and then got taken to the storehouses and the kind of, where all the real stuff is. and just the generosity and the absolute shared understanding of what this means. The best reception I've ever received from any museum in the world has been at the National Museum of Ireland. So I just want to do a shout out to them. Like even better than at our own museums in Canada.
And I suppose if I had more time and a longer paper, which will be reflected in my dissertation, but there really is an interesting relationship between Cree language on this land, because it was and is in some way thought of as a trade language now. There's jokes all across this land, like behind every tree there's a Cree, or Anishinabe's company, but Cree's a crowd. So we know that the language have really, made their presence all across this land. And so in a way it has become a trade language. And I think there's a relationship there with Irish as well. There's a brilliant documentary series that was on RTE. And can't say the name of it, or I'm forgetting the name of it, but it was all about the Irish language and from an Irish point of view, from a Gaeilge point of view. And really what they were talking about, that there was a period in history where Irish was the language of Europe. It was spoken everywhere. So I think there's some very interesting research and that needs to happen. And you're right, some very interesting alliances that we need to maybe remember and bring back together.
Well, I think you'll find it in the language, like linguistic memory, because a lot of times language remembers what we forget. So I think exploring language and music would be very fruitful.
Well, and that's very true, Sherry. There's I've been studying Cree weekly now with Elder Jerry Saddleback from Musqueam, and he's great. He gives the sort of larger cosmology, and even the vowel sounds, as Jeanette was offering earlier. He talks about how that those language or those vowel sounds go back to the Big Bang. That they're so immense in what their meaning is and how they relate to the galaxy. And I think you'd find the same thing looking at Irish vowel sounds, which was why it was such an amazing magical language. And David Abram in his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, really talks about that, how, this notion of being able to write Gaias a long time ago was like creating a spell because of the power imbued in those language sounds. So we need to remember those again.
Yeah, and the power of story. Because I have two uncles who, kind of infuse that love of story in me. One is my Uncle Clifford, and the other one is my Uncle Sonny Boy. And so they come from really different traditions, but their approach to story was very similar.
Well, I think that's a great place to end our conversation for now, but just reminding everyone in the audience as well that we can continue this discussion in the open meeting space, or if you want to try out the network button and meet with someone one-on-one as well. Thank you so much for this incredibly rich pair of panels and for the songs as well. And we'll be continuing the conversation, as I say. Talk to you again soon.
Yes. Thank you for the beautiful song, Cheryl, and to Joel as well.
Yeah.